Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this will be a brief recap of my lecture on the beginnings of Western ethics and Socrates. So in the last lecture, I talked to you about the rise of Athens as a little regional superpower around the Mediterranean. I talked to you a little bit about how the Athenians, along with other Greek city-states, pushed back Persian expansionism, and once the Spartans in particular returned to their isolationist tendencies, that left the Athenians with their powerful navy to dominate much of the Eastern Mediterranean, and this led to a big economic boom that's often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens, which led to a lot of architectural developments and the enhancements of certain cultural experiments that had begun in Athens in previous centuries. Two important ones for our purposes included democracy, which I like to sort of refer to as democracy 1.0, making the point that something like American democracy is democracy 2.0, something reborn in the modern era from the ancient world. So democracy is enhanced as an experiment in ancient Greece in the Golden Age, and as is the court system and trial by jury system that the Greeks had developed as well, specifically the Athenians had developed as well. And when I say that these experiments were enhanced, what I mean is that the stakes were raised during what's called the Golden Age. Because of the economic boom, there was just a lot more power at stake. And because there was so much more power at stake via these institutions of democracy and the court system, this gives rise to the emergence of a new type of professional that we called the sophist. And I referred to the sophists as the first ever professional teachers. Let me clarify that again and say that the sophists are the first ever professional intellectuals, in a sense, that this is the beginnings of setting the stage for the specialization that we see in society today in the universities and colleges, where some people make their living just by focusing on scholarship of texts and writing and teaching. But in particular, the sophists, these sophisticated, worldly wise, well-traveled, well-read individuals, were private tutors, and some of them became associated with what we might call today sophistry, sort of related to the name the sophists, and that is the sort of dark arts of persuasion, in that if you pay me, I can help you defend whatever position you want by any means necessary with regard to sort of verbal combat. And so in service to power, some sophists sold their skills with regard to communication and thought and writing in order to promote whatever agenda their paying clientele would have them promote. And this led to a kind of an association of the sophists with a position that comes to be known as relativism. And that is that there are no value systems that are sort of more right or wrong than any other value systems. It's just a matter of whether or not you're within a particular cultural tradition or not. So again, one important idea for our ethics course will be this idea of cultural relativism that gets associated with some sophists because of this tendency they had to offer their services in defense of whatever agenda was behind paying for their services. And this was threatening to many Athenians who were very proud of themselves and their position in the Mediterranean, proud of their culture. And so this sets up a little bit of a conflict in Athens between what I will call ethical relativism and ethical absolutism. On the one hand, ethical relativism is this position, or cultural relativism in this moment, this position that all value structures with regard to morality and having a good life are simply tied to a cultural tradition, and no tradition is superior to any other tradition. We'll talk about that more later in the term, and contrast that with this position that I'm identifying today as ethical absolutism, and that is the idea that there is sort of one right way to live a good life, and there are sort of one right set of values for being good people. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that in some sense in ancient Athens, you're going to see the collision between these two positions, uh, um, ethical relativism, cultural relativism as associated with some of the sophists, and ethical absolutism associated typically with any ethnocentric position, but that tends to be exacerbated in societies that are in charge in some way of a certain region of the world, whether they're regional superpowers or global superpowers. There's a tendency for the people within those cultures to see their cultural value structure as sort of absolutely right. And within that tension and the historical context that I developed in that opening lecture, we'll see the figure of Socrates emerge. And so in this review, I always like to add just a little bit of nuance to what you've already reviewed in the previous lecture. But, you know, Socrates is going to come to be, in some sense, the martyr for the examined life. His willingness to live as he did, and his willingness to stand trial in the way he did, and his willingness to accept the sentence of execution by hemlock in the way that he did, sets him up to become this symbol or this martyr of the philosophical life. And what I want to suggest to you is that philosophy itself, I think, is best understood as existing between the two positions that I've described for you, a kind of a relativism and an absolutism. Now, if I give you a slightly more nuanced version of that, of course, ethical relativism and ethical absolutism are both positions within philosophy itself. However, the search for wisdom that I've been describing in my lectures so far, the love of wisdom that I've been describing so far, is really in some ways at odds with both relativism and absolutism. If relativism is right, then there isn't any overarching wisdom about how to live a good human life and how to be a moral person. And if absolutism is right, you know, we have to ask the question of, well, who has access to this absolute value set of values, and how do they, whoever has access to this absolute set of values, how do they know that these values are absolute? And it seems to me that a way to read the history of philosophy is to read it as sort of denying that any person so far in history that we know of has had access to some kind of absolute, once and for all set of final answers with regard to these major philosophical questions. As I've argued, in some sense, the philosophical questions are the ones without final and absolute answers, and that's in some sense what makes them philosophical. We have to seek wisdom. We can't just settle for any old opinion or any old cultural tradition. We have to seek a wisdom for living in a moment of history. And so philosophy, and as I'm suggesting today, the symbol of the rise of philosophy in the West, Socrates, exists in between the positions of relativism, that all answers are equal and they're all just relative to, as we've been discussing it, cultural traditions, or we'll look at it later in our lecture series, relative to maybe individual perspectives. So philosophy exists in between relativism and absolutism. And so Socrates emerges into Athens as this person who asks questions, who is, annoying in some ways, admittedly, via his conversational techniques. But mostly it would seem sort of become symbolic of being willing to ask the tough questions to those who pretend to have the answers. And then often that results via the Socratic methodology in showing the lack of knowledge, the non-knowledge that people have. And yet Socrates still saw this work as productive in an important way. It was work which helped people to give birth to a form of understanding, a crucial kind of first step of philosophical understanding, and that is the understanding that you don't have everything figured out yet. And maybe what you already think you have figured out, you really can't justify, explain, or analyze thoroughly so far. So if you know what you can't analyze and what you can't explain and what you can't justify, and in some sense what you don't yet understand in the way that you thought you did, well, now you can begin your philosophical quest for any wisdom that is possible related to those questions. And so Socrates, in some ways, not only is the figure that seems to start the philosophical tradition in the West, especially as it focuses beyond metaphysics on the question of what is a good human life, but he also is the symbol of the starting place for the search for wisdom, and that is the realization that we don't have it all figured out. And, you know, his willingness to live as he did, and the fact that he offered us no teachings that we can, you know, no teachings in writing, at least that we know of, really set in motion then a number of key figures that would carry philosophy forward over the next couple generations, and none more significantly than Plato of Athens. And so in our next lecture, we're going to talk about the first really important writer and the first really important theoretician in Western philosophical tradition, Plato. So I'll look forward to talking to you about Plato in the next lecture.